Welcome to Common Table Conversations. Thank you for being here. My name is Dr. Anthony Headley. I'm a licensed psychologist and emeritus professor of counseling at Asbury Theological Seminary, and I will be your host today. I'm glad to turn things over to our two main speakers today. First, Mr. Alan Cooperman. Since 2014, Mr. Cooperman has provided executive leadership to Pew Research Center's Religion Research Division. Alan is an expert on religion and demographic changes in the United States. Before joining Pew, he was a national reporter, editor, and foreign correspondent for major news outlets. Dr. Amos Yong serves as Dean of the School of Mission and Theology at Fuller Theological Seminary. An acclaimed scholar and theologian, he has authored or edited more than 50 books and 225 scholarly articles. But as an ordained minister, he loves the church and has remained active in service to it. Dr. Young will provide a response following Mr. Cooperman's presentations. To get things started, I'll welcome Alan. Alan, we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Tony, and it's great to be here. And I really appreciate what the Common Table is attempting to do. I thought maybe I would start out by just, before I bring up any slides or talk technically about any of our research, just say a word about what we're trying to do. I was at a different conference not long ago, and the moderator asked the question. She said, "Tell us what you're doing and then tell us what you're doing." And I love that question, and I'll take that approach because at one level, what the Pew Research Center does is high quality, largely quantitative social science, particularly in the areas of survey research around the United States and the world, but also demographic studies and what some people think of as big data or computer science work, content analysis, for example. And we try to do all these things at the level of the very highest peer-reviewed research, but we also try to make them accessible to a broad public. That's kind of at one level. But at another level, there's something else that we're trying to do. And we don't often put this directly into words, though we do clarify that we're a nonprofit organization and also a non-advocacy organization. So we don't take policy positions ever. We also don't sell anything. We don't have any advertisers. We don't have any clients. We don't monetize any of our products in any way. We don't take any government grants, and we don't promote any positions in the area of religion research. We're respectful of all religious traditions, but we don't promote any religious tradition or non-religion. But so at some other broader level, what I think we're trying to do, we're trying to stand for the possibility, I'll just call it a possibility, of making a good faith attempt at impartiality in research. And standing for the possibility, at least in our society, that people can agree on some set of common facts to undergird a serious and good conversation, even if they're going to disagree very strenuously about other things. If we can't agree on any common facts, it's very hard to have a productive conversation. So our mission statement says we will try to provide a foundation of facts to enrich the public dialogue. And I would quickly add, when thinking about social science, that any fact is inseparable from the methods used to create that fact. So we really try to be very transparent about the methods we're using and about degrees of uncertainty. So in particular today, Tad, who very kindly invited me to do this, asked me to talk about some recent research we've done in which we tried to look at current trends in the religious composition of the United States, the shares of people, the percentages of people who identify in various religious ways, how those have been changing, and project that into the future. And so I'd like to say a word about demographic projections, both how they're done and maybe more importantly, why they're done. So demographic projections are very common. You've encountered them even if you don't know it. You've heard that the U.S. Census Bureau has projected that the U.S. population will become majority minority by sometime around 2040. You've heard that the United Nations has projected that the world's population topped 8 billion. That's a projection this year, and will be at more than 9 billion, probably about 9.7 billion by the year 2050. These are demographic projections, and they all scientific demographic projections use a pretty similar basic method. It's called the cohort component method. And so they start with a population divided by age and sex, and they move that population into the future by adding in the factors in demographic growth. So fertility rates, age-specific fertility rates for women, how many children they're expected to have at each year or set of years as they move through their life. Mortality rates, so you subtract out expected deaths, and everybody is aware, every insurance company has them. There are plenty of good actuarial tables, and we're dealing with large numbers of people. They're quite accurate over time, so you subtract out deaths. You add in migration into your population and emigration out of your population expected. And I'll talk a little bit about the religious composition of migrants to the United States today, I hope. And very importantly, if you're dealing with religious populations, you try to factor in a couple of very difficult but important things to consider. One is what I would call intergenerational rates of transmission. That is basically whether parents pass on a religious identity to their children, and then whether people keep that religious identity or change that religious identity over the lifetime. And so we try to avoid the word conversion because it's often freighted with a sense of a particular set of processes that people may or may not do. And what we're really talking about, the method we're really using to do this, is surveys. So that's really self-identification. So I use the term religious switching to indicate when people in the course of their lifetime change the way they identify religiously. Why do we do these projections? A lot of times demographers say projections are not predictions, and journalists and ordinary folks don't understand what they're trying to say when they say that, and they don't get it. If it's not a prediction, then what good is it at all? And I'm going to try to show you today, not just tell you, but show you what a projection can do, because in a way it's an heuristic tool. It's a way of helping you look at and understand the current trends, because really the projections are saying if the current trends continue or if they move in particular directions, this is what will happen. We don't pretend that we know what is going to happen. I can't tell you for sure what the size or composition of the US population will be in 2050. There are any number of things that could change it. But what I can do is I can look at the current trends and the recent past trends, and I can tell you if those trends continue, this is how it will look. And so really the important thing in the trends is not a prediction of where we're going to be. It's a better understanding of the relative impact of the various things that are changing the US population religiously. And I do think for this audience, that will be very interesting. And quick spoiler alert, intergenerational transmission of religion, the share of parents who transmit their religion to their children, that's not the biggest factor. And fertility rates, which in many parts of the world and globally are the big engine of religious change, like differential rates, higher birth rates among some religious groups and others, that's very important worldwide. But in the United States, that's not the biggest factor. And migration, which is so important to religious change in some parts of the world, like Europe, that's not the biggest factor in the United States. In the United States, the biggest factor is religious switching. It's the voluntary change of people beginning usually in the late teen years. That is the biggest factor, at least in the current trends. Now that could change in the future, but that's what we're seeing. And these projections that I will go through will show you. And some of the projections are definitely imaginary. Some of them are not realistic scenarios. We will turn on and turn off. We will imagine, what if there were no immigration? What if there were no more religious switching? What if nobody changed their religious identity anymore? What would the population look like in the future? So some of these things are just, again, I would call them heuristic opportunities. Look, the big picture thing that we're talking about, the big picture trend, is in what sociologists, political scientists will call religious identification, or sometimes people call it religious adherence or religious preference. It's simply the way people answer the question, what is your religion, if any? And we can divide this up into all kinds of ways, but just to take a overly simple, broad look, let's just look at three categories for the moment. Christians of all varieties, people who don't affiliate with any religion, so people who identify as atheist, agnostic, or just don't identify with any religion, and people who hold other religions. So that's Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist, I'm sorry, not atheist, Buddhist, Wiccan, pagan, et cetera, everything else. All those other religions together add up to about 6 or 7% of the US population. I don't mean to ignore them by any way, but they're pretty stable from a low base as a share of the US population, as you can see on this chart, which is showing both Pew Research Center data and data over time from the General Social Survey, which is a very long-running, very highly regarded survey done out of the University of Chicago. And both these surveys find pretty comparable data. We ask the question a little bit different way, so it's a little bit different. The big trend we've been seeing, and basically anybody who asks a religious identification question in a consistent way over time, as you ask the same question, you're going to see the same trend, because you see it in New York Times polls over time, you see it in the American National Education surveys, you see it in every major survey shows the same trend. And it's a declining share of people who identify as Christian and a rising share in the religiously unaffiliated category. And over the last 15 years, it's been a move of about, on average, 1% per year out of the Christian category and into the religiously unaffiliated category. If we were to break down the Christian category, by the way, there's more loss in some subgroups than in others, but it's really pretty across the board. So contrary to what some people might have told you or might have heard, the share of Americans who identify as born again or evangelical Protestants has been declining, as is the share who identify as mainline Protestants and so on. And the religiously unaffiliated, sort of all the subgroups there are also growing, not all at the same rate, but the share who identify as atheist is up, the share who identify as agnostic is up, and the share who just identify as nothing in particular is also up. And these are broad, very broad social trends found in every part of the country, among people of all ethnic and racial categories, among men and women, not all, again, equally, but the overall trend is very, very broad. So that's what we're trying to figure out. And we're trying, in a way, through these projections to understand why that's happening. So let me give you the sort of the first key data point on this, which is this thing that I call intergenerational transmission of religion. Just a fancy way of asking yourself, well, is this because parents aren't transmitting their religion, their religious identity to their children? And that's not what's happening. Actually, in our data, from a very large survey in which we randomly looked at 1,800 pairs of a teenager and a parent, and we asked them separately a whole bunch of questions about their religious identities, beliefs, and practices, we find that the 83% of the Christian parents who have a teen, that teen identifies as Christian. And among the unaffiliated, it's of those who are unaffiliated, atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular, 88% of those parents who have teens, their teens identify as unaffiliated. So there's a little bit of sort of loss in both groups, and the movement is in both directions. Some teens raised unaffiliated become Christian or other religions, and some teens raised Christian become unaffiliated or other religions. But an 80+% rate's a pretty high rate of transmission, and that alone does not come close to accounting for this previous pattern that I showed you. Intergenerational transmission of religion is not the primary cause of this fall off. The primary cause of this fall off is what I'll call religious switching, which just to sort of choose a somewhat arbitrary point in time, but starting at around the age of 15. So mostly it's happening between the ages of 15 and 30. And if you look at this top chart, and I hope it's big enough for you to see, this is showing over time the percentage of people who, in the red bar at the top, say they were raised Christian who are still Christian at the age of 30. And you can see that back in 1990, it was 90%, and it's been steadily going down. And then you can also see the share of people in the top chart, in the gray bar underneath, the share of people who were raised unaffiliated, raised with no religion, who've become Christian, right? Maybe formally through conversion, maybe informally, they just identify as Christian. And that number has been declining. And it's now 21%. And I want you to bookmark that 21% number. That's a really important number. And now look at the bottom chart, and it's showing you the share of people who were raised unaffiliated and are still unaffiliated. That's in the gray bar on the top. And you see that back in 1990, it was 49%. So that's really kind of an interesting thing to realize. Back in 1990, half of the people who were raised unaffiliated didn't stay unaffiliated. Now it's today 73% in the most recent data from 2019. So today, nearly 3/4 of the people who are raised unaffiliated are staying unaffiliated or are still unaffiliated at the age of 30. And in the bottom bar, it's the share of people who were raised Christian who are now unaffiliated. And you can see it's gone from a fairly small percentage, 8% in 1990, and it's risen steadily, and it's now at 31%. So I want you to bookmark those two figures in your head. The 21% of people who were raised unaffiliated have, between the ages of about 15 and 30, become Christian. And about 31% of the people raised Christian have become unaffiliated by the age of 30. Now, there, of course, is some continued religious switching after the age of 30. Particularly, we see this actually with older generations, those generations where they didn't make so much change before the age of 30. And to simplify somewhat, what we see in our numbers is that there's a net movement of about 7% of people who, after the age of 30, leave Christianity and become unaffiliated. Now, of course, there's movement in all directions. There's movement from other religions to Christian, from Christianity to other religions, etc. But somewhat for simplicity's sake, I'm focusing on the big movements here, the big net movements. And the 31% of Christians who become unaffiliated and the 21% of people who are unaffiliated who become Christian, that's a 10-point difference, which may not sound like very much. But here's the other thing to realize. Many more people are raised Christian than raised unaffiliated. So the Christians are still about 64% of the US population in our data, our way of asking the question. The unaffiliated are about 30%. And so there are many more people raised Christian than unaffiliated. So 31% of that bigger group is a lot more people than 21% of the smaller group. It's a difference of millions of people who are moving or have moved over this 15-year period from the Christian category to the unaffiliated category. So in one of our projections, what we did is just assume that we take the current fertility rates, take the current migration rates, the other factors that I talked about, and just focus on this religious switching. And what if those 31% and 21% numbers were just to continue at that pace over the next 50 years? What would the US population look like if those trends continued? And what we would see if that happened is that if that stayed the same, the share of Americans who are unaffiliated with any religion would rise, but it wouldn't be a majority. It would rise from the current 30% to about 41%. And the share of people who identify as Christians, again, Christians of all varieties put together, which, by the way, includes Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Orthodox Christians. So it's the very broad definition of Christian, people who self-identify as Christians. That number would decline. It would be less than a majority, but Christians would still be the largest group, the largest religious group. And other religions would climb, and that's largely actually not because of religious switching. Other religions would climb mostly because of migration. And I'll show you the migration data later. But they would about double in size, again, if current trends were to continue. But we have looked at a bunch of other data around the world. And one of the really interesting things we see when we look at, we've got data on religious switching from about 80 countries, including the United States, and with Christian populations. And that includes all the countries in Western and Eastern Central Europe. And many of those countries have had a lot of secularization. And an interesting thing we've seen, which I think some of you may see as actually good news, is that we don't find any place where the share of all people raised Christians who leave Christianity gets beyond about 50%. That's a kind of a ceiling that we've seen. Now, I don't pretend to say that that's any sort of magic number that could never be exceeded. And this isn't the ultimate share of the population that's Christian. This is the share who switch away. We don't see that exceeding 50% everywhere. So one scenario that we incorporated into the projections is, well, what if that 31% and the 21% number continued, and they continued to rise? That is, they didn't stay steady, because that's not the pattern we've seen in the past. The pattern we've seen in the past actually is that the share of people leaving Christianity has been growing. The share of people staying unaffiliated has been growing. So what if they continued to change those rates, but with a sort of cap that never you get more than 50% of people leaving Christianity? And that's the second from the bottom scenario here. It's what we call religious switching with limits. And if that scenario were followed, then by about 2070, the share of Americans who are Christian would conceivably drop to about 40%, about 39% of the population. And I'll just show you what would happen with limits to that, to the unaffiliated population. It would rise in this chart. It's the second set of dotted lines projected in the future to about 48%. So if that were to happen, we could actually, by 2070, neither group would have a majority of the population, but there'd be a few more unaffiliated people than Christians in the US. There's also a scenario in which there is no, if we imagine there is no limit, no 50% kind of ceiling, and we allow the rates of switching to accelerate as they have in the past. So the thing to realize about the past rates of switching is that they haven't been stable. They've been, if you will, Christian identity has been over time becoming less sticky, and unaffiliated identity has been becoming more sticky in the United States. So if those trends were to continue and without limits, then in sort of the lowest number that we see by 2070, Christians could be about 35% of the population. That's the bottom. And on this one, the top, the unaffiliated could actually be a majority of the population, 52%. Again, let me just emphasize, these are not predictions. A big part of this is just to try to understand the relative influence of various factors and get a sense of where this could head. So we've also did some other scenarios. I'd like to just quickly touch on those before we go into the next breakout. An important one is if every mother transmitted her religion to her children. And I'm going to focus on mothers because about a quarter of American children today live in single-family households, the vast majority of which are headed by a woman. If that were the case, if we were to imagine not 83% transmission, but 100% transmission, and on the other side, 100% transmission, not 88% transmission of unaffiliated identity, interestingly, that the overall trends just wouldn't change that much. And even kind of the outcome numbers don't change that much. You'd still see other religions at 13% by 2070, and you'd still see Christians as being in scenario number 5, again, with perfect transmission, being the largest group, but no longer a majority. Similarly, if Christians have a little bit higher fertility rates than the unaffiliated, that's one of the factors that's important to take into account. It's one of the factors that somewhat reduces the growth of the unaffiliated in these projections. But even if we were to imagine identical fertility rates for all the groups, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. So fertility is not the big driver of these trends. If we were to imagine no more migration into the United States, that would also not greatly change the picture, except in the bottom. In scenario number 7, look at the bottom line. If there were no more migration, the share of people who identify with other, that is non-Christian religions, primarily here we're thinking about Hinduism and Islam and maybe Buddhism and some other Asian religions, those religious groups are growing. There's not that much Jewish immigration into the United States. The Jewish numbers aren't really affected by immigration. But if we were to shut off all immigration, the size of other religious groups would not increase so much. And then here's really interesting one, scenario number 8. And that is, imagine that there were no more switching at all, including no more old switching of people either in young age or older ages. And the interesting thing is that if we stopped all that switching, actually, wait a minute, scenario number 8, I'm sorry, is only stopping the older switching. It's not stopping the younger switching. It doesn't make that much difference. But, and I should have it here. Yes, I'm sorry. It's scenario number 4 is one where we stop, we have no more switching, either younger people or older people. And the interesting thing is that the Christian population would still decline. And the reason for that mostly is because of the age factor. Christians are older than the US population as a whole, and the unaffiliated are younger as a whole. And a younger population, all else held equal, is going to grow faster. The older population obviously is closer to mortality, have more people passing away, and have more people who are past their prime childbearing years. And the younger population has more people who are in or entering their childbearing years. So every demographer knows this. A younger population, all else equal, is going to grow faster. And the point is that actually does make a pretty big difference. And so religious switching plus the older age of the US Christian population, those two things I would say are really important factors that the projections help us to see in the change that's taking place in the US population. And one other final really important break, and we can talk about this in the breakout rooms if you like, or I can come back and talk about it afterwards, is all that I'm talking about here is a measure of religious identification. That is how people identify, how they practice, what they believe, what they do. That's a different thing. And by all means, it's really important to point out that not all people who are unaffiliated are God disbelieving, so to speak. In fact, more than half of them say they believe in God. Some of them, some percentage of them, say they pray, at least on occasion. What the unaffiliated tend not to do is go to religious services. They tend to have very, very low rates of attendance at any kind of religious services. And contrary, again, to what you might have heard, I mean, though there certainly is a cohort of people who identify as spiritual but not religious, the unaffiliated are not, by any measures that I'm aware of, more spiritual than people who are religiously affiliated. They aren't necessarily less spiritual if you define spirituality very broadly, such that pretty much everybody does some spiritual things. They aren't necessarily less, but they do identify as spiritual at lower levels than people who are religiously affiliated. There's people who are religiously affiliated are more likely to say they are both religious and spiritual. And many people who are religiously affiliated do spiritual things like meditate, go on retreats, do yoga, and they do those things at equal or higher rates than the unaffiliated. So there's sometimes a mythical idea that the unaffiliated, well, they don't identify with a religious group, but actually they're super spiritual. I want to sort of, they're not as a whole super spiritual. They're no more spiritual, and in fact, arguably less spiritual than as a whole than people who are religiously unaffiliated. I'm sorry, than people who are religiously affiliated.
I'll turn things over to Dr. Yong, who will offer a reflection on Alan's presentation.
Thank you for the invitation. So much to think about, and hopefully everybody can hear me. I'll make two general sets of comments because I want to hear the questions that people have. First of all, it does seem to me still to be, it seems to me that at least for the next generation, up until 2070, there will still be plenty of Christians in, if you will, specific Christian contexts, congregations, perhaps denominations, as declining as they might be, or networks of churches. And so the charge that I've been given is to reflect on what these trends mean for those who care for Christian clergy and congregations. From that perspective, what are the institutions that support these clergy? Are these denominational institutions? Are these networks of churches kinds of organic networks of affiliations? And how do those of us who might work in these contexts, denominational or networks of churches contexts, then serve the clergy that will be caring for the 46 or 48 or 50% of Christians in the next generation? My other set of remarks, however, address then the growing number of the disaffiliated. That raises the question of who's going to care for those folks. And I think that's where the chaplaincy category continues to emerge as having greater and greater prominence. As was indicated, folks that are disaffiliated are not necessarily more or less spiritual or even more or less religious. And certainly in those contexts, I do think that all human beings will continue to grapple with change, life developments, personal issues, relational issues, and many of those have spiritual components to them, and folks will need to be served in those contexts. So for those of us who are in theological institutional contexts, that does beg the question, all right? Most of our programs at this point serve to form pastors for congregational ministry, but maybe we need to turn much more of our attention to programs that develop our focus on developing chaplains that don't serve in congregational contexts, serve in a variety of business, communal, governmental, other kinds of agency contexts within which then the services to address the needs of those who are religiously unaffiliated can be more directly met. So both those are just sort of the high level reflections. People are still going to need coping skills. People are still going to need skills to make adjustments to life, the world, affiliating, disaffiliating, life, death, births, and so on. And our clergy and our chaplains will continue to be on the front line for all of those realities. And so the question is, how do we continue to support, shape, and form clergy and chaplain? And then how do we, in an ongoing way, continue to support and engage with the growing number of chaplains I think that we are going to need. Thank you.
May I make one quick point, which is that the unaffiliated are clearly measurably less religious as a whole than people who identify religious traditions. That is, they are less likely to believe in God or some other universal spirit. They are less likely to pray. They are less likely to attend religious services. They are less likely to belong to religious congregations. They are less likely to say religion is important in their lives. They're less likely to believe in heaven and hell. They're less likely to read religious texts. They're less likely to do, there's 25 questions I can show you in our data and everybody else's data. They're clearly less religious. Sometimes people, what I hear people say is, but they must be equally spiritual or even more spiritual. And that's a trickier issue. And it depends how you measure this broad thing called spirituality.
I'm wondering now if there are any questions from our participants. Since I don't hear any, let me throw out one of my own. You mentioned this matter of religious switching, Alan, and I was wondering, what do you see as the main factors that contribute to religious switching?
Oh, that's great. And I was really hoping you would ask that, because what I showed in a way are some of the, I would call proximate causes, but I really didn't address the deeper causes. And let me quickly say that I think there are sort of 4 theories about this. One of them is political. One of them says that what's going on is really a backlash against the entanglement of religion and politics, particularly on the conservative side of the equation. And that's why some younger people, in particular, people with more liberal positions who see religion as a whole, rightly or wrongly, it's their perception, as dogmatic, intolerant, et cetera, they're leading. That's sort of one theory. It's probably the leading theory in social science. There's another theory, and these theories are not mutually incompatible. They could all have some elements of truth. Has to do with marriage and families. You know, marriage and families are kind of the main conveyor belt for religion, as I indicated, religious transmission. And marriage is in decline in the United States. It's not so much divorce that's risen, but the share of people who are never married has declined. Fertility rates are really low in the United States. If it weren't for immigration, the size of our population would be declining. We are below replacement level in fertility. So in some ways, what people would say is, well, but look, it's basically the family that's broken. And that's kind of what's breaking the religious transmission vector. A third really important theory about this I call the bowling theory, and that's an allusion to Robert Putnam's famous book, Bowling Alone, in which he argued that broadly, our country is declining in its levels of social capital, particularly what he called bridging capital, a fancy way of saying that people are not engaging in bricks and mortar institutions so much. And it's not just churches and synagogues and mosques that face this decline, broadly speaking. It's every kind of fraternal organization. It's practically every kind of group that brings people together to do things in common, and that our society is atomizing. People are living increasingly individual lives. Some people will bring into this theory the internet, but in fact, these trends began before the internet existed. But it could be that the internet, social media, and living virtual lives as opposed to physical lives could be a part of that sort of this bowling alone phenomenon. And the fourth big theory is really a kind of a global theory. It's a global theory of secularization. Basically, the theory is that as societies provide increasing levels of physical, emotional, and other kinds of security to their people, that the need for religion declines. Some people see this as an anti-religious view, a sort of semi-Marxist view. It's actually, I think, more complicated than that. It isn't necessarily anti-religious to see that religion helps for people in times of need, internally and externally. And if there's less need, there's maybe less need for, if there's less hard times, maybe there's less need for religion. That's sort of another way of thinking about it. But that broad secularization theory is kind of the fourth theory. One other way of thinking about this is to say, okay, there are all these different theories. They may all have a bit of truth, but let's divide it instead of 4 or 8 theories, basically 2 kinds of ways of looking at this. One is that this is a sort of market reaction to the problems, the insufficiencies, the human frailties of religious leaders and institutions. Everything from the sex abuse scandal in the Roman Catholic Church to greed, hypocrisy, and all those things that are just part of human nature and that afflict religious institutions like every other institution, but that turn people off because religious institutions are promoting better behavior and can be seen as hypocritical as well. So if it's a market reaction, that is, if part of the switching away from religion is because of the faults of religion, or at least the perceived faults of religious leaders and institutions, then you could say, okay, well, either religious leaders and institutions will do better and people will come back, or they'll continue to lose. And either way, that's sort of that. The other way of thinking about this, though, really important, and I always challenge secular audiences to think about this, is that, but what if it's not just about that? What if it's a result of broader social changes, this sort of atomization of our society? And what if what's happening to religion is not caused by religion? What if it's a symptom of bigger, broader change, of people living increasingly lonely, decentralized, and less entangled lives? If that's what's going on, then I challenge my secular friends and colleagues to understand or think about this as potentially a really concerning trend, even if they're not particularly religious and don't see the value of religious institutions for our society, which, by the way, most unaffiliated people do. Most unaffiliated people do see value in religious institutions. They also see, of course, some negative things about religion.
One of the questions that was presented was a curiosity about the demographics that have been reported in the UK, which show that Christians are a minority based on census data. And the question is, what can we learn from that population, and how are they the same or different than the American experience?
That's a great question. Every country in Europe and every country in the world is a little bit different traditions, different perspectives, and frankly, also the social science traditions and the way that the questions are asked can be somewhat different. So there's still some room for argument as to what the share of Christians are in the British population, but for sure the overall trend has been downward. And indeed, it is true that by some measures, it's now a minority. I don't think that the European, and I'm going to just broaden it a little bit beyond Britain, that the United States is necessarily following the exact path of Western Europe. I think that's really an oversimplification. Western European countries have established churches, we don't. And a lot of Western European countries have church taxes, where governments collect taxes of people who identify with churches. So there are reasons for leaving religion in the in European countries that don't exist in the United States. We have an extremely vibrant religious ecosphere in the United States, with a lot of switching in all directions and a lot of religious intermarriage. Those things are less common in many other countries, including Western European countries, where there isn't as much religious intermarriage sometimes as there is in the United States. A big thing in Europe is immigration. And one of the things that we could see in our studies in Western Europe is that some people in Western Europe identify as Christian, at least in part to separate themselves from what they see as the new other, that is the rising, in particular, Muslim populations in some Western European countries. I don't think there's anything quite parallel to that in the United States. I don't discount that there's Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and all that. There's definitely othering that goes on in the United States, but I think Christian identity in the United States is somewhat different. So it's a similar broad trend. If you buy the secularization theory, it could have the same causes. I'm actually not a big proponent of that final secularization theory. I don't think it explains what's happened in many parts of the world where there has been economic and development and modernity has come and religion remains very vibrant.
Alan, I was interested that you mentioned church tax, because I was reading some of the literature, particularly in Austria, where it suggested that that was a very significant factor in young people disaffiliating from the church.
Young people, and also one of the things that jumps out at you, in especially in Switzerland, actually, is the share who disaffiliate in middle age, which is so interesting. It's so not the pattern as we see in the US, but guess what? It coincides with when they start to make them fairly significant amounts of money and the taxes start to be considerable. And in Switzerland, the taxes vary by canton, but in some cases they can be actually quite high. So in Germany, for example, they're high, it's like 1 or 2%, but in Switzerland, it can get up as much as 9% in some cantons. So
let me raise another question. One person said, I'm curious if there's any data on how much the culture wars as a whole play into the political theory.
Yeah, so this theory is known in the social sciences, the Haut-Fischer hypothesis, after the two sociologists who were at Berkeley, Mike Haut and Claude Fisher, and you can look it up, and they've written lots of papers about this. And they've used the General Social Survey as their main data set. And even they don't claim that politics or backlash against the entanglement of conservative religion and conservative politics accounts for all of the religious switching, but they do make a case in some of their papers that it accounts for a good portion of it. And the culture, I don't think there's any way to separate out that from the culture wars, but broadly what they see as happening, and they're very articulate about this. And they've done many interviews with younger people in particular. And the way that I've heard Mike Haut talk about it is that younger people say, look, if religion is all about what is sexually okay and what isn't, and how people identify, and it's always excluding people and it's intolerant. If that's what religion is, then I don't want any part of it. And again, I'm not, please don't mishear me. I'm not saying that's what religion is, but that's the perception that some young people hold. And that is what that indeed culture war perception or sense that religion is tied up with the culture wars in a way that is not good for the country. That is what Mike Hout and Claude Fisher have argued is driving some of this change. And we can see in our data as well that the unaffiliated do tend to be younger, and they do tend to be more liberal, and they do tend to see churches and other religious organizations as doing some good things. They see churches and other religious organizations as helping the poor and the needy. They see churches and other religious organizations helping to bring people together. But they also do say churches and other religious organizations are too involved in politics and too concerned with rules. So a kind of sense that their dogma is a word you hear a lot in focus groups and interviews about this.
The next one is a comment, but I think there's an embedded question. So I'll read it. To Dr. Young's good question, maybe the academy needs to change in that it's highly oriented to preparing primarily pastoral and teaching leaders. Perhaps an alternative question is, how do we not only produce shepherds to the unaffiliated, but other Ephesians 4:11 leaders who are more often suited to reaching these people outside of the church? Any response to that comment?
I'd like to let Dr. Young go first, and I could chime in. I'm aware of some efforts along these lines.
Yeah. Dr. Young, I think, actually had to leave. So he's
okay. Well, I'm certainly aware. I think some of you are aware of the group that came out of Harvard Divinity School, runs what's it called? The Sacred. I'm going to somehow drop my synapses aren't fully firing. But a group that were Harvard ministry fellows and worked on sort of paradigms for ministering, without using that term, to the unaffiliated. And sort of within every major religious group that I'm aware of, there are at least some of those efforts. Everything from, theology on tap types of sessions within the Catholic Church to there's a ton of Jewish groups that de-emphasize religion and or at least textual study in a kind of traditional way, and that emphasize Sabbath observance in ways that are just meaningful to people and not necessarily traditional. Groups like One Table, for example, in the Jewish tradition. I think every religious group now has some of this going on. And I think there's a lot of experimentation, a lot of initiative, a lot of energy, creativity going into this. I can't tell you that I have any data on how successful it is.